Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always good to know you're out there joining us every weekend, Saturday and Sunday, 7 a.m. here through Grupo Imagen. There was an extraordinarily important meeting that took place a couple weeks ago. We haven't had the chance to analyze the results of this meeting of the COP27 that took place in Egypt, and whether any major steps were taken to save the environment, to provide humanity better tools to confront climate change. Now, a great friend of this show was there, Ambassador Miguel Ruiz Cabañas, Izquierdo. He participated in this meeting. He was an observer. And you were able to follow very closely, Ambassador, the steps or the negotiations that were that took place. And I just have to ask you right out. Many analysts have underlined that the results show a failure by major countries around the world to reach an agreement that will have an impact on climate change. Am I right? Am I wrong? Are we being unfair? Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ana Maria, for inviting me again. I am very pleased to be here with you and your auditorium. Well, I would say that, these kind of global international conferences are not likely to have, explosive results in terms of it. Now things are completely different. It's really hard to find a conference that accomplishes a complete change of circumstances. I would say that this COP27 has to be seen as a process. There was another conference 1 year ago in Glasgow. There is going to be another conference in Dubai, Arab Emirates next year. So it's like a chain of conferences that are making steps, progress on progress. Sometimes they do go backwards, but it was not the case in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. This year, what we have seen is that some decisions were taken again in the right directions. What was the main result of the conference? The main result was responding a demand presented by poor developing small countries, which have been deeply affected by the losses and damages caused by climate change. These countries, at the same time, are the least responsible of producing climate change because they tend to be small islands in the Pacific, Atlantic, or the Indian Oceans. They are poor. They have no industries. They didn't participate contaminating the world, to put it briefly. But they are affected by climate change and the global warming in terms of, the rise of the level of the sea is rising. Some are really facing an existential threat to their life and to their future. So they are very worried. After many years of asking, understanding and comprehension by especially the developed nations, they got what they wanted. It is that the United Nations going to establish a special fund, a special mechanism, financial mechanism to compensate at least a little bit the losses and damages that they are suffering. That was the main result of this conference. I think it's in the right direction because it represents climate justice. But at the same time, we saw that a proposal that the world as a whole reduces substantially its production and consumption of oil and gas was not adopted. It was not adopted because many countries still resist that they have to reduce their production or their exports, especially for those countries belonging to the OPEC in English. So they still resist that the solution is a deep reduction in the consumption of oil or gas. That was, the thing that I didn't like it, and many people didn't like it as a result of the conference. At the same time, the real worrisome situation, Ana Maria, is that today the world produces the double of emissions that we produced 30 years ago when the whole process of these conferences started. So we are not making progress enough to really prevent a major disaster in the future. According to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world has to reduce 45% of current emissions of gases with a warming effect before the year 2030, in 7 years. And this is not happening. So this decade is the decade that something substantial, something very important has to take place. Let's hope that it will happen in the coming 7 years.
I agree with your pessimism because, when I was writing one of my first books on national security, there was debate even among analysts. This was about, 17 years ago, whether climate change should be considered a national security threat. And at the time, Miguel, I can't remember if you and I had this debate, but most analysts thought, that the impact of climate change was so far in the future that humanity really did have some time to be able to find a solution, to take the necessary steps to try to at least not face this catastrophic future that analysts have been talking about in the last, 20, 25 years. Al Gore, remember Al Gore was talking about this. And he was, there's always a political aspect to these debates, but they thought he was exaggerating. Well, now I don't think there is a country in the world, major countries in the world, that don't consider climate change and a potential national security threat in the short term. And Mexico has has spoken about it in those terms. Clearly, the United States, the Pentagon has papers that have written about it. So I just don't know whether there's unless something catastrophic happens in the next, 2 or 3 years, whether there's going to be that ability for countries where there's democratically elected leaders to be able to take the steps, which will involve some type of pain. And they're just politically, it just doesn't seem feasible. Now, with that said, let's talk about what happened with the Mexico's proposal. I mean, it was very interesting because John Kerry, who represents the United States, represents Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, for a climate change strategy. He was here in Mexico a week before this meeting took place in Egypt, and there was a very interesting proposals that came out from Mexico based on these meetings. Can you just kind of give us a general sense as to what Mexico is proposing?
Well, yes, Ana Maria, thank you for asking me that, because I think it was really important and it was news that Mexico was presenting a new national determined contribution for emissions reduction. In accordance with the Paris Agreement, countries are supposed to present what is going to be their contribution in emissions reductions. They are called national determined contribution because each country decides what's the amount of the contribution they are going to make, throughout the next 20 years. So Mexico had presented a national determined contribution that would represent 22% of emissions reductions for the year 2030. Well, the good news was that a government represented by the Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard, they decided to present a new national determined contribution amounting 35% of emissions reduction. That is a major increase of almost 60% in the ambition of reducing emissions. So the key of this is, well, two things here. On the one hand, John Kerry came to Mexico, visited, and had extensive meetings with President Lopez Obrador and members of his cabinet, with Marcelo Ebrard. And after 5 visits to Mexico in the last 18 months, he was able to convince Lopez Obrador on the importance of reducing emissions, and that the importance that Mexico would be, a full participant in this global exercise. So the government decided to present this new plan with this general goal of 35% reduction of emissions, which is very ambitious. And it includes several things. It includes 90% reduction of emissions of methane gas. This gas is produced by oil production in the Gulf of Mexico. So if that is accomplished, Mexico has to invest at least $2 billion in this plan of eliminating methane emissions in the Gulf of Mexico. But it also includes, new natural protected areas, reforestation programs, and also producing twice as much of energy coming out of clean sources, that is solar energy and wind energy. And that's a major challenge, because to duplicate the production of energy coming from clean sources, it really demands a big increase in investment in these new sources, in new plants, and nobody exactly knows how is the government planning to do this, but they committed to do it. They announced it with John Kerry during the conference, and again they have already presented this to the United Nations process. So it seems to be a very serious commitment. And so for me, the key question is how they are going to accomplish this. According to the numbers they presented, it represents 48 billion investment in dollars in 8 years. So it's a huge amount of money, and Mexico has decided to take this step. Mm-hmm. As a Mexican, I like to, that this new commitment made by Mexico. Let's see how they are planning to accomplish it in the coming years.
No, that's a very good question. I mean, the proposals were very interesting. They were presented by Secretary of Foreign Relations Marcelo Ebrard, and I mean, when I heard his presentation, I was quite surprised, because it seems that in some aspects it may contradict this government's current policy, not completely, but more importantly, where the resources are going to come. So it'll be interesting to follow, and at least it's on the table, and it can be followed up. In the short term, what will happen now? By the way, everybody joining us is Ambassador Miguel Ruiz Cabañas. He is a career ambassador. He's been ambassador in many countries, including Japan. He was headed the OAS, Organization of American States delegation. Mexican delegation. We've known each other for years. He teaches at Tec de Monterrey right now, and he heads it's a very interesting kind of think tank out of the Tec de Monterrey that has to do with sustainable development. Is that correct, Miguel? And then what happens now?
Well, I'm sorry. I think I missed something.
Yeah.
Question. Sorry.
No, what are going to be the next steps now?
Countries have to accelerate their mitigation ambition. They have to present new proposals, new national determined contributions to reduce substantially their emissions. There are two ways of doing this. Generally speaking, one, you reduces production and consumption of fossil fuel energies, or you apply new technologies that they do exist, that utilizing oil and gas, still you have, something in place that captures those emissions, and you prevent those emissions going into the atmosphere. the two ways are possible, but the two ways are costly. And at the same time, the invasion of Russia in Ukraine disrupted in a little bit the energy markets in the world. So the European Union countries are really presented with a big challenge on how they are going to pass the winter season without the oil and gas coming from Russia. So they are asking for alternatives in African countries. They are increasing or accelerating their plans to make a transition to clean energy sources, but that really takes time. It is not easy to do it, obviously, in 1 year. They will not do it in 1 year, but this is a period of transition that has to take place. At the end, there are really the G20 countries, including Mexico. We represent 1.5% of global emissions. Mexico, also the G20 countries have the solution of this incredible existential threat to humanity. This is something that the humanity as a whole had never seen before. So the response has to come from those countries that are really producing climate change. And those countries happen to be the same members of the G20. Yeah. So the key for resolving the problem relies on those 20 countries. One good thing that happened in Sharm el-Sheikh during the conference was the reestablishment of dialogue between the United States and China.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that dialogue had been interrupted in the spring and summer because of this visit made by the then Speaker Nancy Pelosi when she decided to go to Taiwan, and then that was a big disruption of the bilateral relationship between China and the US. That relationship apparently has been reestablished, and I think for both countries, they do consider that climate change affects national security.
Yeah.
So it comes as an indicator of the goodwill of the other country, just when they say, well, let's cooperate on this because this is a threat for both of us and the rest of the world.
Well, I always appreciate you joining us here on Living in Mexico, Ambassador Miguel Ruiz Cabañas. It was a little confusing. I was trying to remind our audience that you head at the Tec de Monterrey, a think tank that is the Sustainable Development Objectives Initiative. And it's important for people to know that that's what you are doing now, in addition to teaching. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for mentioning, Ana Maria. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're listening and watching Living in Mexico. I'll be right back.